Marcus Thompson had always been a reasonable man. At 42, he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Denver, Colorado, and prided himself on following rules and maintaining good relationships with his neighbors. He lived in a tidy suburban community called Meadowbrook Heights, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. The neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association that had more rules than the IRS. The HOA president, Mrs. Dorothy Henley, was a 70-year-old retired teacher who treated the community guidelines like sacred scripture. She measured grass height with a ruler, inspected mailboxes for rust spots, and sent violation notices faster than Amazon delivered packages. Marcus lived at 247 Maple Street in a modest 2-story colonial with a 2-car garage. He had purchased the home 3 years earlier after his divorce, seeking a quiet place to rebuild his life. The garage was his sanctuary, one bay for his reliable Honda Civic, the other for his weekend project car, a 1967 Mustang convertible that he was slowly restoring to its former glory. Next door at 245 Maple Street lived the Hendersons, Janet and Bob, a couple in their 50s who seemed pleasant enough at neighborhood barbecues. They had 2 teenage children and drove matching silver SUVs that barely fit in their own garage, alongside Bob's motorcycle and Janet's pottery wheel. The Hendersons were notorious for their creative parking solutions, often leaving vehicles in their driveway, on the street, or sometimes in spaces that weren't technically theirs. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday morning in July. Marcus stepped outside to retrieve his newspaper and nearly choked on his coffee. There, sitting boldly in his garage, was Bob Henderson's motorcycle, a shiny black Harley-Davidson that had somehow found its way into the empty bay where Marcus usually parked his Civic. Marcus stood there for a full minute, blinking in disbelief. His garage door had been closed and locked the night before. He always made sure of that. Yet somehow Bob's motorcycle was now sitting pretty next to his covered Mustang, as if it belonged there. Walking around to the front of his garage, Marcus noticed that his automatic garage door opener had been tampered with. Someone had managed to force it open, not damaged exactly, but definitely manipulated. His blood pressure began to rise as he realized what had happened. He marched next door and knocked on the Hendersons' front door. Janet answered, wearing her morning robe and holding a cup of coffee. Her smile faded when she saw Marcus's expression. "Good morning, Marcus. You look upset. Is everything all right?" "Janet, Bob's motorcycle is in my garage." "How did it get there?" Janet's face turned pink. She glanced over Marcus's shoulder toward his garage, then back at him. "Oh, that. Well, you see, we had some family visiting last night and we needed the extra space. Bob noticed your garage was half empty, and we thought maybe you wouldn't mind if we borrowed it for just one night." Marcus felt his jaw drop. "Borrowed it? You broke into my garage without asking and just moved in?" "We didn't break in," Janet protested. "Bob knows about garage door openers. He used to install them. We were very careful not to damage anything. We figured you'd understand, we're neighbors after all." "Neighbors don't just take other people's property without asking," Marcus replied, struggling to keep his voice level. "I need that motorcycle moved immediately." Janet's expression hardened. "Look, Marcus, Bob had to leave early for work. He won't be back until evening. The motorcycle isn't hurting anything. Can't it just stay there for today? We promise we'll move it tonight." Marcus stared at her in amazement. Not only had they violated his property, but now they were asking him to accommodate their convenience. "No, Janet, I need it moved now. I have errands to run and I can't get my car out. Can't you just move the motorcycle yourself? It's not that heavy if you know how to handle it." The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus had never moved a motorcycle in his life and wasn't about to risk damaging it or injuring himself because of the Hendersons' entitlement. "I'm not touching Bob's motorcycle. This is his mess to clean up. I want it out of my garage by noon or I'm calling the police." Janet's friendly demeanor evaporated completely. "The police? Really, Marcus? Over something this small? We're trying to be neighborly here. You've got a whole empty bay just sitting there doing nothing." "It's my empty bay on my property behind my locked door." Marcus emphasized each word. "Just because I'm not using it doesn't give you the right to help yourself." After a tense back and forth, Janet finally called Bob at work. Marcus could hear Bob's voice through the phone, clearly irritated at being bothered during his workday. The conversation grew heated, with Janet whispering angrily and shooting Marcus disapproving looks. Finally, she hung up. Bob says he can't leave work right now. He's got an important meeting. He'll move it tonight when he gets home. That's not acceptable, Marcus said firmly. I have plans today that require my car. Then move the motorcycle yourself or find another way to get around. Bob can't just abandon his responsibilities for something this trivial. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. In their minds, he was being unreasonable for wanting access to his own garage. They seemed genuinely puzzled by his anger, as if he was overreacting to a minor inconvenience rather than responding to a clear violation of his property rights. The conversation ended with no resolution. Janet retreated into her house, muttering about difficult neighbors, while Marcus stood in his driveway fuming and planning his next move. He had given them until noon, a deadline that was rapidly approaching with no sign of compliance from the Henderson household. Looking back at his garage, where Bob's motorcycle sat like a defiant squatter, Marcus realized this wasn't just about parking. This was about respect, boundaries, and the fundamental principle that people shouldn't take what doesn't belong to them. The Hendersons had crossed a line, and their casual dismissal of his concerns only made it worse. As the morning sun climbed higher and noon approached, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. If the Hendersons wanted to play games with property rights, he was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Noon came and went without any sign of Bob Henderson or his motorcycle moving from Marcus's garage. Marcus had spent the morning pacing his living room, checking his watch every few minutes and growing increasingly frustrated with each passing hour. The Hendersons' cavalier attitude had transformed his usual calm demeanor into something approaching rage. At 12:30 p.m., Marcus walked next door and knocked again. This time, Janet took several minutes to answer, and when she did, she seemed less apologetic than annoyed. Marcus, I told you Bob would handle this tonight. Why are you bothering us again? Because it's past noon and that motorcycle is still in my garage, Marcus replied. I told you I had errands to run today, Janet sighed dramatically. Look, I called Bob again and he's stuck in meetings until late afternoon. There's nothing I can do about it. Can't you just work around it for one day? Work around it? Janet, it's my garage. I shouldn't have to work around anything in my own garage. You're really making a big deal out of nothing, Janet said, crossing her arms. It's just a motorcycle. It's not like we parked a truck in there. Marcus felt his patience snap. The Hendersons clearly had no intention of respecting his deadline or his property rights. They seemed to believe that their inconvenience trumped his rights as a homeowner. Fine, he said quietly. If that's how you want to play this. Janet misinterpreted his calm tone as acceptance. Good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Bob will move it tonight, I promise. Marcus walked back to his house without another word. In his mind, a plan was already forming. A plan that would teach the Hendersons about the consequences of taking what wasn't theirs. First, he called his workplace and told them he would be working from home for the afternoon due to a property emergency. Then he made a call to Denver Lock and Key, a 24-hour locksmith service he had used once before when he locked himself out. I need someone to come out and change the locks on my garage, he told the dispatcher. It's urgent. Someone has been accessing my property without permission. The locksmith, a friendly man named Tony, arrived within an hour. He was a stocky guy with graying hair and hands that spoke of decades working with tools and locks. Someone broke into your garage? Tony asked as he examined the door. Not exactly broke in, Marcus explained. My neighbor somehow got the door open and parked his motorcycle inside without permission. Now he's refusing to move it on my timeline. Tony whistled low. That's bold. So you want to change the locks to keep him out? Something like that, Marcus said with a slight smile. Tony looked at the situation and nodded knowingly. I've seen this before. Neighbor disputes can get ugly. You want me to install new locks on both the side door and the main garage door? Both doors, and I want them to be good quality locks. The kind that can't be easily tampered with. As Tony worked, he chatted about similar situations he had encountered. Had a customer last year whose neighbor kept using their driveway for overflow parking during parties. Customer got tired of it and had me install a gate with a lock. Neighbor learned real quick about property rights after that. The locksmith work took about 2 hours. Tony installed heavy-duty deadbolts on the side door and replaced the garage door lock with a more secure mechanism. When he finished, Marcus had the only keys to his garage. There you go, Tony said, packing up his tools. "Nobody's getting in there without your permission now." Marcus paid the bill and watched Tony drive away. Then he stood in his driveway, looking at his garage with a sense of satisfaction. Bob's motorcycle was now securely locked inside, and only Marcus held the keys. Around 4 o'clock, Janet Henderson appeared in her front yard, watering her flower beds. She waved cheerfully at Marcus, apparently still under the impression that he had accepted their arrangement. "Bob should be home around 6, she called out. "He'll move the bike right after dinner." Marcus simply nodded and went back inside. He had dinner plans of his own to finalize. At 5:30, Marcus heard Bob Henderson's SUV pull into the driveway next door. Through his window, he watched Bob get out of his vehicle and walk toward Marcus's garage, probably expecting to retrieve his motorcycle and end what he likely saw as a minor disagreement between neighbors. Marcus stepped outside to watch the show. Bob walked confidently to the side door of Marcus's garage and tried to turn the handle. Nothing happened. He tried again, pushing harder this time. Still nothing. Confusion spread across Bob's face as he realized the door was locked. Bob walked around to the front of the garage and tried to activate the automatic door opener the same way he had the night before. The door didn't budge. "Hey, Marcus," Bob called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Something's wrong with your garage door. I can't get it open." Marcus walked down his driveway with his hands in his pockets. "Nothing's wrong with it, Bob. I had the locks changed." Bob stared at him for a moment, processing this information. "You changed the locks? Why would you do that?" "Because you broke into my garage and parked your motorcycle there without permission," Marcus replied calmly. "And when I asked you to move it, you refused." "I didn't refuse. I told Janet I'd move it tonight." "You told Janet you'd move it when it was convenient for you. This morning, I told you I needed it moved by noon. It's now almost 6 o'clock. Bob's face was turning red. "So you locked my motorcycle in your garage?" "That's theft, Marcus. You can't just steal someone's property." "I didn't steal anything," Marcus said evenly. "Your motorcycle is exactly where you put it, in my garage. I just secured my property so no one else could break in again." "Break in?" "I didn't break in. I just opened the door." "You opened a door that was locked on property that doesn't belong to you without the owner's permission. In most places, that's called breaking and entering." By now, Janet had come outside to see what the commotion was about. She looked back and forth between the two men, clearly sensing that the situation had escalated beyond what she had expected. "What's going on?" she asked Bob. "He locked my bike in his garage," Bob said, his voice rising. "He changed the locks." Janet turned to Marcus with an expression of disbelief. "You can't do that. That's Bob's motorcycle." "And this is my garage," Marcus replied. "Your husband put his motorcycle in my garage without permission. Now he can get it back when I decide to let him have access to my property again." The confrontation in Marcus's driveway quickly attracted attention from other neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had emerged to check her mailbox, but lingered, obviously eavesdropping. The Johnsons from 2 houses down were pretending to walk their dog while clearly listening to every word. Bob Henderson's face had progressed from red to purple. "Marcus, this is insane. You can't just lock up someone else's property because you're having a tantrum." "A tantrum?" Marcus almost laughed at the description. "Bob, you broke into my garage. That's not a tantrum, that's a crime." "I didn't break anything," Bob protested. "The door opened just fine. Because you forced it open. That's still breaking and entering whether you damaged the mechanism or not." Janet stepped closer, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Marcus, please be reasonable. Bob needs his motorcycle for work tomorrow. He uses it to get to job sites. Then he should have thought about that before he parked it in someone else's garage without permission," Marcus replied. Bob was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "Okay, look, maybe we should have asked first. I admit that. But we're neighbors. I figured you'd be cool with helping us out for one night. You figured wrong. So what do you want? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. I apologize. Now can you please unlock the garage so I can get my bike?" Marcus considered this for a moment. Under normal circumstances, an apology might have been enough. But the Hendersons' behavior throughout the day had shown they didn't really understand what they had done wrong. They were apologizing for getting caught, not for violating his property rights. "I appreciate the apology, Bob, but I don't think you really get it. You spent all day acting like I was being unreasonable for wanting access to my own garage. Your wife told me to move your motorcycle myself, or find another way to get around. That's not how neighbors treat each other. Come on, man. What do you want me to do? Get down on my knees and beg forgiveness? I said I was sorry. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked the weather app. Actually, Bob, I've been thinking about taking a vacation. I haven't had a real break in over a year. The couple exchanged glances, unsure where this was heading. That's nice, Janet said cautiously. When are you thinking of going? Tomorrow morning, Marcus said. I'm planning to drive up to Yellowstone. Maybe do some camping, some hiking. I've always wanted to see the geysers. Bob looked confused. Okay, good for you. But what does that have to do with my motorcycle? Well, I'll need to lock up the house before I go. That includes the garage, of course. I'll probably be gone for about 10 days. The implications hit Bob like a freight train. You're not seriously going to leave my motorcycle locked in your garage for 10 days. Why not? It's safe there. Much safer than leaving it on the street, Janet gasped. You can't do that. Bob has to work. Bob should have thought about that before he decided to use my garage as his personal parking lot. This is crazy, Bob said, his voice cracking slightly. You're talking about holding my property hostage for 10 days because I parked in your garage for one night? I'm not holding anything hostage, Marcus corrected. I'm going on vacation and I'm securing my property before I leave. Your motorcycle just happens to be inside my property because you put it there. Mrs. Patterson had given up any pretense of checking her mail and was now standing at the end of her driveway, openly watching the drama unfold. The Johnsons had been joined by their next-door neighbors, the Chens, who were pretending to examine their lawn sprinkler system. You're being vindictive, Janet accused. This is way out of proportion to what happened, is it? Marcus asked. Let's think about this logically. You took my property without permission. When I asked you to return it, you told me it would happen on your timeline, not mine. You showed no respect for my rights as the property owner. Now you're upset because I'm exercising those same property rights in a way that inconveniences you. Bob tried a different approach. Look, Marcus, I get it. We screwed up. But I'm a contractor. I need that bike to get to work sites. Some of my clients are in areas where a car won't fit, but a motorcycle will. If I can't work, I can't pay my bills. Then maybe you should have considered that before you parked it in someone else's garage. What if I pay you? Bob asked desperately. Like a parking fee or something? I'll give you $100 for the inconvenience. Marcus shook his head. This isn't about money, Bob. This is about respect and boundaries. 200? Bob, stop! You're missing the point entirely. Janet tried a different strategy. What if we promise it will never happen again? We'll even put it in writing if you want. You shouldn't have done it the first time, Marcus replied. The fact that you don't understand why it was wrong is exactly why this lesson is necessary. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Henley, the HOA president, had arrived and was listening intently while pretending to inspect the curbing for violations. Several other neighbors had found reasons to be outside, walking dogs, checking mailboxes, or watering lawns. Bob was getting desperate. Fine, what do you want? Tell me what it will take to get my motorcycle back tonight. Marcus thought about it seriously. I want you to understand that what you did was wrong. Not because you got caught, not because it inconvenienced me, but because you took something that didn't belong to you without permission. I understand that. Do you? Because when your wife called me unreasonable for wanting access to my own garage, it didn't sound like you understood. When she told me to move your motorcycle myself or find another way to get around, it didn't sound like you understood. Bob looked genuinely confused. I wasn't even home when Janet said those things. But you agreed with her, didn't you? When she called you at work, you told her you couldn't leave your meeting to move the bike. You prioritized your convenience over making right what you had done wrong. I had important meetings, and I had important errands, but somehow your meetings were more important than my property rights. The crowd was growing larger. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that Marcus Thompson had locked Bob Henderson's motorcycle in his garage and was refusing to let him have it back. People were taking sides, with some supporting Marcus's right to secure his property, and others thinking he was being petty and vindictive. Mrs. Henley stepped forward, her HOA president authority radiating from her small frame. What exactly is going on here? I'm hearing all sorts of rumors. Bob immediately turned to her like a lifeline. Mrs. Henley, thank goodness you're here. Marcus locked my motorcycle in his garage and won't let me have it back. Isn't there some kind of HOA rule against holding someone's property hostage? Mrs. Henley looked at Marcus with raised eyebrows. Is this true, Marcus? Bob's motorcycle is in my garage because he put it there without my permission, Marcus explained calmly. I've secured my garage to prevent further unauthorized access to my property. But surely you can unlock it so Bob can retrieve his motorcycle. I could, Marcus agreed. But I've decided to go on vacation tomorrow morning, and I want to make sure my garage is properly secured while I'm away. Mrs. Henley studied both men carefully. As HOA president, she had dealt with her share of neighbor disputes, but this was a new one. Mrs. Henley had seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize when a situation was about more than just parking. She looked around at the growing crowd of residents, then back at Marcus and Bob. I think we all need to calm down and discuss this rationally, she said, in her authoritative teacher voice. Bob, is it true that you parked your motorcycle in Marcus's garage without his permission? Bob shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, but we didn't think he'd mind. It was just for one night and he had the space. Did you ask his permission first? No, but Mrs. Henley held up her hand. And Marcus, is it true that you've locked Bob's motorcycle in your garage and are refusing to let him retrieve it? I've secured my garage after an unauthorized entry, Marcus replied carefully. The motorcycle is exactly where Bob put it. Mrs. Henley nodded slowly. As much as she loved enforcing HOA rules, she also understood property rights. Bob, you do realize that entering someone else's garage without permission is a serious matter? I didn't break anything, Bob protested. I know how garage door openers work. I was careful. That's not the point, Mrs. Henley said sternly. The point is that you accessed someone else's property without their consent. That's trespassing regardless of whether you caused damage. Janet jumped in. But Mrs. Henley, Marcus is being unreasonable. He's talking about going on vacation for 10 days and leaving Bob's motorcycle locked up. Bob needs it for work. And Bob needed permission before he used Marcus's garage, Mrs. Henley replied. I'm afraid I have to side with Marcus on this one. If someone used my garage without permission, I'd be furious too. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several neighbors nodded, clearly understanding Marcus's position better, now that Mrs. Henley had explained it in simple terms. Bob's face fell as he realized he was losing support. So what am I supposed to do? I can't get to work without my bike. You could take your car, Marcus suggested helpfully. Some of my job sites don't have parking for cars. The bike lets me get into tight spaces. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you parked it in someone else's garage. Mrs. Patterson from across the street spoke up. Bob, my late husband, was a contractor too. He always said the first rule of the business was to respect other people's property. You can't just help yourself to whatever's convenient. Bob looked around at the faces surrounding him and realized that public opinion was turning against him. The neighbors were no longer seeing this as Marcus being petty. They were seeing it as Bob facing the consequences of his own actions. Okay, look, Bob said, desperation creeping into his voice. What if I admit I was completely wrong? What if I apologize publicly right here in front of everyone? Marcus considered this. Go ahead, Bob cleared his throat. I want everyone to know that I made a serious mistake. I entered Marcus's garage without his permission, and that was wrong. I violated his property rights, and when he asked me to fix the situation, I didn't treat it with the seriousness it deserved. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry to you, and I'm sorry to the neighborhood for causing this disturbance. It was a good apology, better than Marcus had expected. But he could see that Bob still didn't truly understand the deeper issue. I appreciate that, Bob. But I have to ask, if Mrs. Henley hadn't shown up and explained why what you did was wrong, would you have apologized? Or would you still be calling me unreasonable? Bob hesitated, and that hesitation told Marcus everything he needed to know. You see, Marcus continued, you're apologizing because you realize you're not getting support from the neighbors, not because you truly understand what you did wrong. You're sorry you got caught and faced consequences, but you're not sorry about violating my property rights. That's not true, Bob protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Janet tried again. Marcus, please. Bob has apologized. What more do you want? I want him to understand that other people's property isn't his to use just because it's convenient. I want him to understand that when someone tells you to return their property, you don't get to negotiate the timeline based on your schedule. Mrs. Chen, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Marcus is right. Last month, the Hendersons borrowed our ladder without asking. We only found out because I saw Bob using it in his yard. When my husband asked for it back, Bob said he needed it for another day or two. And remember when they used the Pattersons' driveway for their daughter's graduation party? Added Mr. Johnson. They didn't ask, just put up signs directing people to park there. Marcus looked around in surprise. This has happened before? Several neighbors began sharing stories. The Hendersons had apparently developed a pattern of helping themselves to other people's property and spaces when it suited them. They borrowed tools without asking, used other people's trash bins when theirs were full, and had even been caught using the community pool after hours. Bob and Janet looked increasingly uncomfortable as story after story emerged. They had clearly thought their behavior was acceptable, or at least that no one would make a fuss about it. We always return things, Janet said weakly. Eventually, Mrs. Patterson corrected, but only after we track you down and ask for them back. Mrs. Henley was taking notes in the small notebook she always carried for HOA business. It sounds like there's a pattern here. Bob, Janet, this is concerning behavior. The HOA takes property rights very seriously. Are you threatening us? Bob asked. I'm informing you that repeated violations of neighbors' property rights could result in HOA action, including fines or other consequences. The crowd was now clearly on Marcus's side. What had started as Bob trying to pressure Marcus into being reasonable had backfired spectacularly, revealing a pattern of entitled behavior that had apparently been bothering the neighborhood for some time. Marcus felt vindicated, but also slightly sad. He had hoped the Hendersons would simply understand and apologize sincerely. Instead, it had taken public pressure and the threat of HOA action to get even a superficial apology. So what now? Bob asked quietly. Marcus looked at his watch. It was getting late and he had preparations to make for his trip. Now I finish packing for my vacation. I'm leaving early tomorrow morning, and my motorcycle will be perfectly safe in my garage while I'm gone. For 10 days. That's the plan. Janet looked like she might cry. Marcus, this is destroying our family. Bob won't be able to work. We have bills to pay. You should have thought about that before you decided to use my property without permission, Marcus replied. But his tone was gentler now. Look, Janet, I understand this is inconvenient for you, but actions have consequences. Your husband violated my property rights, and when I asked for it to be corrected, you both acted like I was being unreasonable. This is the natural consequence of that behavior. Bob tried one last desperate plea. What if I pay for your vacation? Hotels, gas, food, everything. Just let me get my bike back. Marcus shook his head. Bob, you're still not getting it. This isn't about money or compensation. This is about learning to respect other people's property and rights. The crowd began to disperse as it became clear that Marcus wasn't going to change his mind. Several neighbors patted him on the back or made supportive comments as they walked away. Mrs. Henley lingered to exchange phone numbers with Marcus in case any issues arose while he was gone. As the street emptied, Bob and Janet were left standing in their driveway looking defeated and angry. Marcus went inside to finish packing, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation for his upcoming trip. Marcus woke up at 5 a.m. the next morning, feeling more refreshed than he had in months. The decision to take a spontaneous vacation had energized him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent the previous evening making reservations at a campground near Yellowstone, packing his camping gear and planning his route. As he loaded his Honda Civic with camping supplies, sleeping bag, and enough food for several days, he could hear muffled arguing coming from the Henderson house next door. Through their kitchen window, he could see Bob pacing back and forth while Janet sat at the table with her head in her hands. Marcus felt a small pang of guilt, but only a small one. He reminded himself that this situation was entirely of the Hendersons' making. They had created this problem with their entitled behavior, and now they were facing the consequences. At 6 a.m. sharp, Marcus pulled out of his driveway. As he drove past the Henderson house, he noticed Bob standing at his front window watching him leave. Their eyes met for a moment, and Marcus gave a small wave before continuing down the street. The drive to Yellowstone was spectacular. Marcus had forgotten how much he enjoyed road trips. He took his time, stopping at scenic overlooks and small towns along the way. For the first time in years, he felt truly free from the stress and routine of daily life. Meanwhile, back in Meadowbrook Heights, the Henderson household was in chaos. Bob had called his boss to explain that his motorcycle was temporarily unavailable. and that he might need to use a company truck for jobs in tight spaces. His boss was not pleased, especially since two of their biggest contracts involved work in narrow urban alleys, where only a motorcycle could navigate easily. "What do you mean temporarily unavailable?" his boss had demanded. "Did it break down? Is it in the shop?" Bob couldn't bring himself to admit the truth, that his motorcycle was locked in his neighbor's garage because he had parked it there without permission. Instead, he mumbled something about mechanical issues and promised to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. By day 3 of Marcus's vacation, word of the situation had spread throughout the neighborhood. The story had evolved and grown in the telling, with some versions portraying Marcus as a hero standing up for property rights, and others painting him as a vindictive neighbor taking revenge over a minor slight. Mrs. Henley had become an unofficial mediator, fielding phone calls from both sides. Janet called her daily, begging her to intervene and convince Marcus to return early from his vacation. Other neighbors called to express their support for Marcus's actions or to share their own stories of the Hendersons' boundary-crossing behavior. "The more I hear about this situation," Mrs. Henley confided to her friend Margaret during their daily walk, "the more I think Marcus is doing exactly the right thing. The Hendersons have been getting away with this kind of behavior for too long." Bob's work situation continued to deteriorate. Without his motorcycle, he had already missed 2 important jobs and had to turn down a lucrative contract that required access to a construction site with extremely limited vehicle access. His boss was growing increasingly impatient with the mechanical issues excuse. On day 4, Janet tried a new approach. She drove to the local police station to file a complaint against Marcus for theft of her husband's motorcycle. The desk sergeant listened patiently to her story, took some notes, and then explained why no crime had been committed. "Ma'am, from what you're telling me, your husband placed his motorcycle in Mr. Thompson's garage without permission. Mr. Thompson then secured his own property. The motorcycle is still exactly where your husband put it. Mr. Thompson hasn't moved it or taken possession of it, but he won't let Bob get it back."
"He doesn't have to provide access to his property if he doesn't want to," the sergeant explained patiently.
"Your husband trespassed on Mr. Thompson's property. If anyone committed a crime here, it was your husband, not Mr. Thompson." Janet left the police station feeling frustrated and defeated. The legal system wasn't going to help her, and Marcus was somewhere in Wyoming enjoying his vacation while her family's life fell apart. Meanwhile, Marcus was having the time of his life. He had hiked through the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, watched Old Faithful erupt 3 times, and even spotted a family of elk grazing near his campsite. Each night, as he sat by his campfire under the star-filled sky, he felt more convinced that taking this stand had been the right decision. On day 5, Bob's boss finally demanded the truth about the mechanical issues. When Bob reluctantly explained the real situation, his boss's reaction was swift and harsh. "Let me get this straight," his boss said incredulously. "You parked your motorcycle in someone else's garage without permission, and now you can't get it back? And you've been lying to me about it for a week?" Bob tried to explain that he hadn't really lied, just avoided giving the full details, but his boss wasn't buying it. "Bob, this is the most unprofessional thing I've ever heard. Not only did you commit what sounds like trespassing, but you've been dishonest with me about why you can't do your job. I'm putting you on unpaid leave until you sort this mess out." That evening, Janet was in tears as she called her sister in California to explain the situation. "I don't understand why Marcus is being so cruel. It's just a motorcycle. He's destroying Bob's career over a parking space." Her sister listened to the story and then asked the question that Janet had been avoiding. "Did you really think it was okay to just use someone's garage without asking? It was an emergency situation. We had family visiting and we needed the space. But you didn't ask first? We figured he'd understand. Neighbors are supposed to help each other. Helping and taking without permission are 2 different things, Janet. If you needed help, you should have knocked on his door and asked." The conversation with her sister forced Janet to confront what she had been trying to avoid. That maybe, just maybe, they had been in the wrong from the beginning. Back in Yellowstone, Marcus was enjoying a peaceful morning by the lake when his phone rang. It was Mrs. Henley. "Marcus, I hope you're having a wonderful vacation," she said warmly. "I am, thank you. Is everything all right at home?" "Well, that depends on your perspective. The Henderson situation has become quite the neighborhood talking point. Janet has been calling me daily, begging me to somehow convince you to come home early. Marcus chuckled. I bet she has. She also went to the police to try to file theft charges against you. How did that go? About as well as you'd expect. The sergeant explained to her that you haven't stolen anything, and that if anyone committed a crime, it was Bob for trespassing. Marcus felt a surge of vindication. Good to know the law is on my side. It is, but I have to ask, are you really planning to stay away for the full 10 days? Bob has apparently lost some work over this. Marcus considered this. Part of him felt bad about Bob's work troubles, but another part of him recognized that this was exactly the kind of consequence that might finally teach the Hendersons about respecting other people's property. Mrs. Henley, let me ask you something. In all the conversations you've had with Janet this week, has she ever acknowledged that what they did was wrong? Not just apologized because they got caught, but actually understood why it was wrong? There was a long pause. No, Marcus. She keeps talking about how you're being unreasonable and how this is all blown out of proportion. She doesn't seem to grasp that they violated your property rights. Then I think my point hasn't been made yet. The other neighbors are mostly supporting you, by the way. Word has gotten out about the Hendersons' pattern of borrowing things without asking, and several people have come forward with their own stories. Marcus wasn't entirely surprised. The behavior he had witnessed suggested a pattern, rather than an isolated incident. What kind of stories? Oh, everything from using other people's trash bins to borrowing tools without asking to using the Chen's garden hose when theirs broke. Apparently this has been going on for a while, but people were too polite to make a fuss. Until now. Until now, Mrs. Henley agreed. Your situation has opened the floodgates. People are realizing they don't have to just put up with boundary-crossing behavior in the name of being neighborly. After hanging up with Mrs. Henley, Marcus sat by the lake and thought about his situation. He was enjoying his vacation, but he also recognized that the Hendersons were facing real consequences for their actions. Bob's job troubles were serious, and Marcus didn't want to be responsible for destroying someone's livelihood over a parking dispute. On the other hand, the Hendersons still didn't seem to understand what they had done wrong. They were focused on the consequences they were facing, rather than the behavior that had caused those consequences. Marcus decided to extend his vacation by 2 more days, giving himself time to really think about how he wanted this situation to end. He wanted to make his point about property rights and respect, but he also wanted to be fair and reasonable. As the sun set over Yellowstone Lake, Marcus began formulating a plan for how to resolve this situation once and for all. On day 8 of Marcus's vacation, he made a decision that would change everything. He was sitting by his campfire, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky, when he realized that his point had been made. The Hendersons were facing real consequences for their actions. The neighborhood was talking about property rights and boundaries, and he had gotten the best vacation he'd had in years. More importantly, he had received a text message that afternoon that suggested the Hendersons might finally be starting to understand the gravity of their actions. The message was from Janet. Marcus, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell you something. Bob told me the truth about what his boss said when he found out about the motorcycle situation. We're both starting to realize that this isn't just about parking. We violated your property and your trust, and we didn't take it seriously when you tried to address it reasonably. I'm not asking you to come home early or change your plans. I just wanted you to know that we're finally understanding what we did wrong. I hope you can forgive us someday. Marcus read the message several times. For the first time since this whole situation began, Janet seemed to actually understand the issue. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't making demands, and wasn't calling him unreasonable. She was taking responsibility. The next morning, Marcus called Mrs. Henley. How are things in the neighborhood? He asked. Interesting, actually. Janet came to see me yesterday evening. She seemed different, less angry, more thoughtful. She asked me to explain exactly why what they did was wrong, from a legal and ethical standpoint. What did you tell her? I explained that property rights are fundamental to our society. That trust between neighbors depends on respecting boundaries. That helping each other is wonderful, but it requires permission and mutual agreement. How did she respond? She listened. Really listened. And then she asked what they could do to make things right with you and with the neighborhood. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. What did you suggest? I told her that apologies are good, but changed behavior is better. That if they really want to make amends, they need to demonstrate that they understand and respect other people's property rights going forward. Marcus made his decision. Mrs. Henley, I'm coming home tomorrow, but I want to handle this carefully. Can you set up a meeting? Not just with the Hendersons, but with the other neighbors who've had issues with them. Are you sure? You still have 2 days left on your vacation? I'm sure. I think it's time to resolve this properly. The next afternoon, Marcus pulled into his driveway to find a small crowd gathered in his front yard. Mrs. Henley had organized what she called a neighborhood discussion about property rights and community boundaries. The Hendersons were there looking nervous and subdued. So were the Pattersons, the Chens, the Johnsons, and several other neighbors who had stories to share about boundary issues. Marcus got out of his car, tanned and relaxed from his 9 days in the wilderness. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the tense faces around him was striking. Welcome home, Mrs. Henley said warmly. How was Yellowstone? Incredible, Marcus replied genuinely. Best vacation I've ever taken. Bob Henderson stepped forward, his face serious. Marcus, before we discuss anything else, I need to say something. I've had 9 days to think about what I did, and I want to apologize properly. Marcus nodded for him to continue. I violated your property rights. I entered your garage without permission, and when you told me to remove my motorcycle, I prioritized my convenience over your rights as a property owner. When you set a deadline, I ignored it because I thought my schedule was more important than your concerns. That was wrong. And I understand now why you did what you did. It was a much better apology than Bob's first attempt. Marcus could hear the sincerity in his voice. I appreciate that, Bob. What's changed your mind? Bob looked embarrassed. Losing my job helped put things in perspective. My boss fired me yesterday, not just for the motorcycle situation, but because he said I showed a pattern of poor judgment and dishonesty. He was right. I've been treating other people's property like it was mine to use whenever I wanted. Janet stepped forward. That goes for me too, Marcus. I spent 9 days angry at you for being unreasonable, but Mrs. Henley helped me understand that you weren't being unreasonable at all. You were standing up for your rights after we violated them. Mrs. Patterson spoke up. This has been good for the whole neighborhood. We've been talking about boundaries and respect, and several people have admitted they've been afraid to speak up when their property was used without permission. Mr. Chen nodded. My wife and I talked about the latter situation. We never said anything because we didn't want to seem petty, but it bothered us that Bob took it without asking. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. The conversation had evolved beyond his specific situation with the Hendersons to a broader discussion about community standards and mutual respect. Here's what I've learned from this experience, Marcus said. Good neighbors help each other, but help requires communication and consent. Taking what you need without asking isn't helping. It's taking advantage. Bob nodded vigorously. You're absolutely right. And I want everyone to know that Janet and I are committed to doing better. We've made a list of everyone we've borrowed from or inconvenienced, and we want to make individual apologies. That's a good start, Mrs. Henley said approvingly. But the real test will be your behavior going forward. Marcus walked toward his garage, pulling out his keys. The crowd followed him, understanding that this was the moment of resolution. Bob, your motorcycle is exactly where you left it, Marcus said as he unlocked the side door. It's been perfectly safe. Bob's relief was visible as he saw his motorcycle sitting undamaged in the garage. Thank you for keeping it safe. And Marcus, I know this might sound crazy, but thank you for teaching me this lesson. I needed to learn it. As Bob wheeled his motorcycle out of the garage, several neighbors applauded. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for 9 days was finally lifting. There's one more thing, Janet said as the crowd began to disperse. Bob and I want to contribute to the neighborhood in a positive way. We're thinking about organizing a tool-sharing program where people can officially borrow and lend things to each other, with proper communication and tracking. Mrs. Henley's eyes lit up. That's an excellent idea. It would formalize the helpful neighbor concept, while ensuring everyone's property rights are respected. Over the following weeks, the Henderson tool-sharing program became a model for the entire HOA. Neighbors could register tools they were willing to lend, and borrowers had to sign them out and return them by agreed-upon dates. It turned what had been a source of conflict into a genuine community asset. Bob eventually found a new job with a company that valued his skills and his newfound respect for professional boundaries. The motorcycle incident became a turning point in his approach to both work and personal relationships. Marcus never regretted his decision to lock the motorcycle in his garage or take his spontaneous vacation. The 9 days in Yellowstone had refreshed his spirit, and the stand he took had improved his neighborhood. Sometimes, he reflected, the most difficult conversations lead to the most positive changes. 6 months later, when Bob borrowed Marcus's hedge trimmer through the official tool-sharing program, both men smiled at how far they had come from that contentious July evening, when a simple property dispute had escalated into a neighborhood-wide discussion about respect, boundaries, and what it really means to be good neighbors.